You are standing in a room where the air feels heavy, almost thick with the scent of ozone and the faint, bitter, metallic tang of machined copper. The year is 1946, but time inside this specific concrete laboratory doesn't move the way it does in the outside world. Here, in the quiet, desolate stretches of the New Mexico desert, the ticking of a wall clock is not a measure of passing minutes, but a steady countdown toward an invisible threshold. The lights overhead do not buzz. They hum with a low, vibrating frequency that seems to settle directly into the marrow of your bones. Outside, the high desert wind sweeps across the mesas, rattling the loose pane of a distant window. But inside this room, the silence is absolute, heavy, and fragile. You look down at your hands. They are steady, resting against the cold, unyielding surface of a wooden workbench. In front of you sits a sphere of polished metal, no larger than a heavy grapefruit, cradled within two shimmering, silver-hued domes of beryllium. It looks entirely innocent, a masterpiece of industrial geometry, reflecting the dull gray light of the laboratory. It is cool to the touch, almost soothingly so, given the heat of the desert afternoon bleeding through the walls. But you know exactly what sleeps inside that metallic skin. It is an artifact born of the stars, refined by the minds of desperate men, and now trapped in a state of suspended animation. It is a mass of plutonium that the men around here have taken to calling the demon core. They whisper the name with a strange, nervous familiarity, a shield of dark humor meant to ward off the reality of what they are playing with. You can feel the gaze of the other men in the room. Though no one is speaking, they are standing just a few paces back, some leaning against a metal filing cabinet, another scribbling notes on a clipboard with the dry, rhythmic scratch of graphite on paper. They trust you. You are the expert, the one who coaxes the beast to the very edge of its awakening without letting it cross the line. Your tool of choice is not a complex mechanism of gears and levers, but a simple, flat-headed steel screwdriver. It is a common object, something you might find in a kitchen drawer or an automobile repair kit. Yet here it serves as the fragile wedge, holding apart two halves of a potential sun. You slide the blade between the beryllium hemispheres, tilting it just a fraction of a millimeter, watching the needles on the nearby radiation counters dance a slow, predictable waltz. You feel a profound sense of isolation in this moment, a detachment that comes from knowing that the line between life and a silent, agonizing death is thinner than a human hair. The psychological weight is not a sudden crushing blow. It is a slow, accumulating pressure. You are aware of your heartbeat, a steady thudding in your chest that seems entirely out of sync with the stillness of the room. You know that if your hand slips, if your fingers twitch from a sudden cramp or a moment of wandering focus, the world will not end with a dramatic explosion. There will be no fire, no smoke, no shattering glass. There will only be a sudden, beautiful, terrifying flash of blue light, a silent ghost of radiation that will pass through your clothes, your flesh, and your DNA in less than a heartbeat, sealing your fate before you can even draw your next breath. You look at the screwdriver, its plastic handle worn smooth by hours of use. It represents the hubris of an era that moved too fast, a generation of brilliant minds that unlocked the deepest secrets of the universe before they learned how to respect them. There is an eerie peace in this realization. The danger doesn't feel like an enemy. It feels like a companion, a quiet entity sitting across the table from you, waiting to see who will blink first. You are not thinking about the grand politics of the war that just ended, or the geopolitical chessboard being drawn in Washington and Moscow. Your universe has shrunk to the space of a few inches, bounded by the silver curves of the beryllium shield and the precise, deliberate movements of your own muscles. You notice a small smudge of grease on the lower dome, a human imperfection on a machine designed for absolute perfection. It reminds you that despite the towering intellects that built this place, the entire enterprise is still terrifyingly human. The calculations on the blackboards in the hallway are precise to the nth degree, but the execution relies on the steady grip of a tired man at the end of a long week. You breathe out, a slow, deliberate exhalation, watching the way the air slightly fogs the polished metal before vanishing. The core remains silent, a heavy, dark heart waiting for a mistake. You begin to realize that the silence itself is a deception. If you could hear the subatomic world, the room would be filled with a deafening roar, a frantic storm of particles colliding and bouncing, looking for a way to break free. But to your human ears, there is only the hum of the transformer and the distant, lonely sigh of the wind outside. This contrast between the invisible fury of the physics and the calm stillness of the room creates a strange, dreamlike atmosphere. It is the perfect environment for a mind to wander, to question the morality of what has been done here, and to wonder how long a man can walk along the edge of a cliff before the wind finally pushes him over. You look towards the window, where the late afternoon sun is casting long, amber shadows across the floorboards. The shadows look like dark fingers reaching for the workbench, slowly reclaiming the room as the day dies. There is a melancholy beauty to it, a reminder that the world outside continues to spin, completely unaware of the delicate balance being maintained in this hidden corner of New Mexico. People are driving cars, making dinner, sleeping in their beds, entirely oblivious to the fact that a handful of men in khaki trousers and rolled-up sleeves are holding the keys to an artificial hell. You feel a subtle shift in the room's energy, a collective tightening of muscles as you prepare to make the next adjustment. The men behind you have stopped shuffling their feet. The scratch of the pencil has ceased. In this stillness, you are acutely aware of the fragility of your own body. You are made of soft tissue, water, and fragile bones, standing before a force that can unravel the very bonds that hold your atoms together. It is an asymmetric confrontation, man versus the fundamental building blocks of reality, and yet there is no fear, only a profound, almost hypnotic focus. You begin to understand that this laboratory is a temple of sorts, a place where humanity confronts its own limitations and its own terrifying capacity for creation. The demon core is not just a piece of engineering, it is a mirror, reflecting the darkness and the light of the human condition. It represents the ultimate achievement of logic, paired with the ultimate gamble of existence. As you prepare to move the screwdriver just a fraction more, you are hyper-aware of the silence, a silence that feels like a question, waiting for an answer. You find your thoughts drifting away from the metallic gleam of the workbench, traveling backward through the fog of memory to the places that shaped the hands now holding the screwdriver. Before you were a sentinel at the gates of the atomic age, you were a child of a different century, growing up in a world that still believed the horizon had limits. You remember the crisp, sharp air of your youth, the smell of old paper in your father's study, and the comforting predictability of a world governed by classical rules. There was a time when science felt like a grand, romantic map being unfurled by gentlemen explorers, not a desperate race into the dark conducted by weary men in concrete bunkers. You recall the exact moment the universe began to lose its innocence in your eyes. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a quiet realization in a university lecture hall, watching a professor scrawl equations across a cracked slate blackboard. You saw how the neat, solid geometry of the old world was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a strange, ghostly realm where matter was mostly empty space, and energy could freeze into substance. You were captivated by the elegance of it, the sheer intellectual thrill of looking behind the curtain of reality. You didn't see the weapons hidden within those equations. You saw poetry written in the language of mathematics. You were young, ambitious, and blinded by the beautiful light of pure discovery. You remember the call that brought you here, to this high, lonely mesa in New Mexico. It arrived with the weight of official authority, a discreetly worded letter, a train ticket, and a demand for total silence. You left behind the quiet ivory towers and the comfortable routines of academic life to vanish into a landscape of dust, barbed wire, and sudden, frantic construction. When you first arrived, Los Alamos was a chaotic frontier town of brilliant minds, a makeshift colony of geniuses living in muddy barracks and working under the watchful eyes of military handlers. You were fueled by a collective, burning urgency, a shared belief that you were building a shield to save civilization from a monstrous darkness. You recall the frantic energy of those early days, the midnight arguments over coffee in chipped mugs, the frantic scratch of slide rules, and the intoxicating feeling of operating on the absolute frontier of human knowledge. There was a camaraderie born of isolation and shared peril. You weren't just colleagues, you were conspirators in a cosmic heist, stealing the fire of the sun to end a global slaughter. You didn't sleep much back then. The adrenaline of the chase kept you awake, your mind constantly spinning through configurations of uranium and plutonium, calculating the precise geometries required to force an unwilling element to explode. But you remember, too, the day the wind changed. It was the summer of 1945, in the gray, pre-dawn light of the desert floor at the Trinity site. You were standing miles away, your eyes shielded, waiting for the culmination of all your sleepless nights. When the detonation occurred, it wasn't just a flash of light. It was a fundamental rupture in the fabric of human history. You felt the heat of a new sun on your face, a searing, unnatural warmth that seemed to pierce right through your closed eyelids. The sound followed, a deep, primal roar that shook the earth beneath your boots and rolled across the desert like the voice of an angry deity. In that terrifyingly beautiful moment, the romance of pure physics evaporated, replaced by the heavy, cold reality of what you had actually unleashed. You look back at the core sitting on the workbench in front of you, realizing it is the direct lineage of that morning in the desert. The war is over now. The empires that threatened the world have been broken, yet the machinery of destruction you helped create remains behind, demanding maintenance, demanding testing, demanding your absolute presence. The frantic urgency of wartime survival has faded, leaving behind a strange, hollow vacuum filled only by routine and the gathering chill of a new, unspoken conflict. You are no longer saving the world. You are tending to a laboratory specimen that has already outlived its original purpose. You reflect on the invisible scars this place has left on you and the people around you. You have watched your friends grow old in the span of a few months, their faces lined with a weariness that sleep cannot cure. You have seen the way they look at their own hands, wondering if the unseen particles they handle every day are slowly, silently, rewriting their scripts from the inside out. There is an unspoken pact of silence among you all, a refusal to speak of the nightmares that haunt the edges of your sleep, or the growing sense of unease that comes from knowing you have built something humanity may not be mature enough to control. You remember your first partner in these critical assembly experiments, a brilliant, charismatic young scientist who possessed an almost casual defiance of danger. He used to handle the core with the same easy confidence you're trying to maintain today, treating the deadly mass of plutonium like a familiar puzzle. You remember the day his hand slipped, the brief, horrific blue glow that filled the room for a fraction of a second, and the calm, resigned look on his face as he realized his life had just been measured in days. You sat by his bed in the hospital, watching the invisible fire consume him from the inside out, an agonizing process that no medicine could halt. He was the first sacrifice to this metallic idol, and his empty chair in the laboratory is a constant, silent warning. You realize that his death didn't stop the work, it merely intensified the isolation. The military security tightened. The procedures became more rigid, but the fundamental nature of the gamble remained exactly the same. You stepped into his shoes, taking over the dangerous dance because you believed your hands were steadier, your mind more disciplined. But now, in the deep quiet of this afternoon, you see the illusion of that control. You are not the master of this material. You are merely its temporary keeper, holding your breath while it waits for its next opportunity to break free. You look down at the screwdriver, feeling the coldness of the metal handle vibrating slightly against your palm. The memories of your innocence, your ambition, and your losses coalesce into a heavy, quiet weight resting on your shoulders. You cannot go back to the university lecture halls. You cannot unlearn the secrets you have discovered. You are bound to this workbench, tied by a thread of responsibility and a strange, fatalistic curiosity to the very entity that took your friend and changed the course of human destiny forever. You feel the steady, unyielding pressure of the screwdriver resting against your palm, a physical link to a career built on navigating the knife edge of catastrophe to the world outside this laboratory. The end of the war meant a return to normalcy, a collective sigh of relief as soldiers returned home and factories shifted away from the machinery of death. But for you, the peace brought no discharge, no deceleration. Instead, it brought an ascent into an even deeper layer of isolation, where the boundaries between scientific exploration and existential gambling became permanently blurred. You were no longer just a researcher. You had become the high priest of a hazardous new domain, tasked with defining the exact limits of human survival in the presence of the ultimate element. You recall how the atmosphere within the project shifted once the immediate crisis of the war subsided. The frantic, collaborative chaos of the early days was systematically replaced by an eerie, institutional coldness. The military overseers wanted data. They wanted numbers, curves, and precise charts detailing exactly how close a subcritical mass could be pushed before it crossed the threshold into a self-sustaining chain reaction. They called these procedures tickling the dragon's tail, a phrase that always tasted like ash in your mouth. It was a term coined to normalize the absurd, to lend a sense of playful mastery to an activity that was, in reality, a blind negotiation with a force that possessed no mercy and no concept of human error. You remember the day you were officially given charge of the Corps' testing schedule. It felt less like a promotion and more like a sentence. Your peers looked at you with a mixture of reverence and quiet pity, knowing that every successful experiment you performed merely set the bar higher for the next one. You learned to develop a hyper-acute awareness of your surroundings, an almost supernatural sensitivity to the microenvironment of the laboratory. You could tell the relative humidity of the room by the way the air felt against your skin. You could sense the slight expansion of the beryllium domes as the ambient temperature in the room fluctuated with the desert sun. You had to, because even the slightest environmental variable could alter the behavior of the atoms sleeping within the core. You look closely at the gap between the two silver hemispheres, a space no wider than a matchstick. Your mind reconstructs the invisible architecture of the experiment. The beryllium domes are designed to act as a mirror for neutrons, catching the tiny particles escaping from the plutonium core and reflecting them right back into its heart. By lowering the upper dome, you are increasing the efficiency of this reflection, forcing the core to dance closer and closer to criticality. It is a game of pure geometry, played out in a microscopic realm you can only perceive through the erratic clicking of the audio monitors. The faster the clicks, the closer the dragon is to waking up. You have learned to read those clicks like a musician reads sheet music, anticipating the subtle tempo changes before they register on the dials. You reflect on the strange psychology of your position. In any other field of human endeavor, expertise brings a sense of security, a feeling that experience reduces risk. But here, the opposite is true. Every hour you spend over the workbench increases the statistical probability of a mistake. Familiarity breeds a quiet, insidious complacency, a loosening of the tight coil of fear that keeps your hand steady. You have to consciously fight against your own comfort, forcing yourself to remember that the polished sphere in front of you doesn't know who you are, doesn't care about your achievements, and will destroy you just as quickly as it did the novice who came before you. You recall the arguments you had with the safety committees, brief flashes of administrative friction that highlighted the growing divide between those who wrote the regulations and those who actually lived them. They wanted remote control systems, mechanical jigs, and elaborate systems of pulleys and cables to perform these adjustments from behind heavy lead walls. But you resisted. You argued that a machine possessed no intuition, no ability to feel a sudden resistance in the metal, or to sense the subtle, unquantifiable shifts in the environment that a trained human hand could detect instantly. You believed, with a stubbornness that looks dangerously like arrogance, in the retrospect of the quiet afternoon, that your direct touch was the safest mechanism available. You watch a bead of sweat trace a slow, agonizing path down the side of your face, hanging for a moment at the edge of your jawline, before dropping silently onto the collar of your shirt. You don't dare wipe it away. Any sudden movement, any shift in your weight could cause your fingers to tighten on the handle of the screwdriver. You realize that your entire life has been distilled into this single posture, bent over a wooden table, muscles locked in a state of dynamic tension, maintaining a precise distance between two pieces of metal that want nothing more than to come together. You think of the letters you write home to your family, exercises in profound omission. You write about the weather, the beauty of the New Mexico sunsets, and the books you are reading to pass the evenings. You cannot tell them that you spend your days holding open the jaws of an atomic furnace with a hand tool. You cannot explain to them the profound loneliness that comes from carrying a secret that separates you from the rest of the human race. When they ask about your work, you speak in vague generalities about efficiency studies and materials testing, terms so sterile they seem to belong to a completely different universe than the one you inhabit. You notice that the rhythmic clicking of the radiation counter has begun to crowd together, the individual sounds merging into a low, purring rattle. It is the signature of the approach, the sound of the core beginning to notice its own reflection in the beryllium mirror. The air in the room feels strangely colder now, an illusion created by the sudden spike of adrenaline clearing through your system. You are at the summit of your method, the highest point of the ascent, where the view is spectacular, but the footing is entirely ice. You look down at your reflection in the upper dome, distorted and curved by the silver surface. Your face looks elongated, ghostly, like a figure peering out from a dark window in an abandoned house. It occurs to you that you are no longer entirely a part of the living world. You have become an appendage of the apparatus, a biological component in a physics experiment that has been running since the dawn of the Manhattan Project. You are bound to the core by an invisible, unbreakable bond, and as the afternoon light begins to fail, you realize that the ascent has brought you to a place from which there is no easy descent. You are staring directly into the heart of the apparatus, and a profound, chilling realization begins to settle over your mind. The silence in the laboratory is no longer just the absence of sound. It has transformed into a heavy, suffocating pressure. The absolute isolation of a man who has climbed so high that the rest of the world has dropped completely out of sight. You are surrounded by colleagues, men who share your clearance and your background. Yet you have never felt more entirely alone. They are watching your hands. They're breathing shallow and synchronized with your movements, but they cannot share the terrifying intimacy of what your fingers are experiencing through the handle of that screwdriver. You feel the weight of the entire atomic infrastructure resting on this single point of contact. This sphere of plutonium is not just a laboratory specimen, it is the physical manifestation of a new global order. Millions of dollars, thousands of hours of industrial labor, and the highest intellectual achievements of human history have all converged onto this wooden workbench. It is the apex of modern power, a substance so refined and concentrated that a few kilograms of it can alter the geopolitical landscape for generations. And yet, its stability depends entirely on the micro movements of your thumb and forefinger. You are holding the crown jewels of an empire, and the crown is heavy enough to crush you. You look at the silver sheen of the beryllium hemispheres and realize how deeply your relationship with reality has shifted. To the average person outside these fences, power is represented by vast armies, rumbling tanks, or towering skyscrapers. To you, true power is silent, invisible, and compact enough to fit into an ordinary briefcase. It is a power that operates on a timescale of microseconds and at distances smaller than an atom. This knowledge alters your perception of everything around you. The solid brick walls of the laboratory, the heavy oak tables, the steel safes, they all begin to look transparent, fragile, like tissue paper waiting to be scorched by a sudden flash of light. You notice that your breath has become a conscious, deliberate effort. Each inhalation must be smooth, each exhalation controlled, ensuring that your chest does not expand too sharply against the edge of the workbench. You are trapped in a prison of your own expertise. The project leaders have given you total autonomy because you are the only one with the specific, tactile intuition to perform these critical manual adjustments. But that autonomy is a golden cage. It means that if something goes wrong, there is no one to blame, no mechanical failure to point to, and no safety valve to rescue you. You are the final authority, and you're entirely exposed. You think about the concept of the future, a concept that feels increasingly abstract inside this room. For most people, the future is a horizon stretching out over years, decades, or generations. For you, the future is a sequence of infinite, microscopic increments. It is the next half millimeter of movement. It is the next 10 seconds of stability. It is the question of whether the radiation counter will continue its steady rattle or suddenly blur into a solid, lethal shriek. You have traded the broad, expansive timeline of human life for the hyper-focused, immediate present of the atomic nucleus. You reflect on the strange, almost religious devotion that this work demands. You have sacrificed your health, your peace of mind, and your ability to connect with regular human society to become a custodian of this material. You can no longer sit at a dinner table or walk down a city street without seeing the world through the prism of decay, constants, and neutron cross-sections. You look at a wooden chair and think of carbon moderation. You look at a glass of water and think of shielding values. The beautiful, chaotic variety of everyday life has been flattened into a rigid, mathematical matrix. This is the true price of the pinnacle. You don't just work with the core, you see the universe through its eyes. You look back down at the gap between the domes, noting how the reflections of the overhead fluorescent tubes distort along the silver curves. The light looks cold, artificial, completely devoid of the warmth of the sun setting outside. It occurs to you that you are operating in a space that is fundamentally hostile to life. Plutonium does not exist in nature. It is an element manufactured by human ingenuity, a heavy synthetic ghost forced into existence in the dark bellies of production reactors. It doesn't belong in this world, and its entire physical nature is an attempt to tear itself apart, to decay, to transform into something else. You are trying to maintain an artificial stability in an object that inherently wants to disrupt it. You feel a wave of profound fatigue wash over you, not of the muscles, but of the spirit. The constant vigilance, the unyielding demand for absolute perfection, is a slow poison that drains your inner reserves day by day. You can feel the nervous energy vibrating along your optic nerve, making the edges of the silver domes seem to shimmer slightly in the gray laboratory light. You know this is the most dangerous moment, the point where exhaustion mimics comfort, where the mind whispers that it is safe to relax, that the screwdriver will hold, that the dragon is asleep. You force your eyes to blink, clearing the film of dryness, recentering your focus on the precise geometry of the blade. You realize that this experiment is an exercise in profound self-effacement. To succeed, you must eliminate everything that makes you human: your emotions, your fatigue, your doubts, and your spontaneous impulses. You must become as predictable, as rigid, and as unyielding as the steel tool in your hand. You are trying to transform yourself into a flawless component of a physical apparatus, but the ticking of your heart, the warmth of your skin, and the sweat on your brow are constant, stubborn reminders that you are still a creature of flesh and blood, trying to play a game designed for machines. You watch the shadow of your hand stretch across the table, blending with the dark spaces beneath the apparatus. In this dimming light, the core seems to possess its own distinct gravity, drawing your attention, your energy, and your thoughts deep into its center. You are at the absolute center of your world, perched on the highest peak of isolation, watching the invisible particles dance their silent, furious waltz within the silver cage you have built for them. You feel a sudden, microscopic vibration travel up the shaft of the screwdriver. It is a sensation so faint that no instrument in the room registers it, but to your hyper-focused nerves, it feels like a tectonic shift. The flat edge of the steel blade, worn smooth by dozens of similar experiments, finds a microscopic flaw in the lip of the upper beryllium dome, a tiny fraction of a millimeter, an imperceptible slip. In the world of classical mechanics, it is nothing, a negligible scratch on a piece of hardware. But in the world you have built on this wooden workbench, it is the moment the dam begins to break. You watch, as if in slow motion, as the upper dome tilts. The precise parallel alignment you have maintained for the last hour fractures instantly. The gap on the left side narrows, the silver hemisphere dropping toward its lower counterpart with a terrifying, smooth finality. Your muscles lock, your fingers gripping the plastic handle, with enough force to turn your knuckles a stark, bloodless white. But the momentum of the heavy metal is already beyond the correction of human reflexes. The steel wedge of the screwdriver, once your trusted protector, slides uselessly against the polished curve, losing its purchase entirely. You don't hear a mechanical crash. The two halves don't slam together with a loud bang. Instead, the room is instantly illuminated by a silent, brilliant flash of ghost blue light. It is not fire. It is not a spark. It is the pure, unadulterated color of the atmosphere itself ionizing under a sudden, monstrous wave of radiation. The light doesn't just hit your eyes. It seems to ignite directly inside your brain, filling your vision with a blinding, ethereal luminescence that obliterates the gray shadows of the laboratory afternoon. In that exact microsecond, the temperature of the air around the core doesn't rise, but a wave of phantom heat seems to pass right through your chest. You hear the radiation counters. The steady, purring rattle you had been reading, like sheet music, doesn't speed up. It vanishes entirely, replaced by a solid, continuous, deafening shriek. As the electronics overload under a bombardment they were never designed to measure. Behind you, the silence of the other men is instantly shattered. A chair scrapes violently against the floorboards. A clipboard clatters to the ground. Someone lets out a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. They don't need to look at the dials. They saw the blue glow. They know what that color means. You act on pure, ancient instinct, bypassing the conscious logic that has guided your entire career. With your bare right hand, you reach directly into the invisible furnace, grasping the blistering top hemisphere of the beryllium dome. and wrenching it away from the core, flipping it onto the floor, where it rolls with a heavy, hollow clang. The action takes less than half a second, a brilliant display of physical courage and immediate crisis management. By breaking the geometry, you have killed the reaction. You have stopped the chain. The blue light vanishes as quickly as it appeared. The deafening shriek of the counters decaying back into a frantic, erratic chatter. You stand upright, your chest heaving. Looking down at the workbench, the core is silent again, resting innocently in its lower cradle, looking completely unchanged. It isn't smoking, it isn't glowing. It is still a dull, heavy grapefruit of metal, but the air in the room is now thick with the unmistakable heavy smell of ozone, a scent like a lightning strike that has occurred indoors. Your hand, the one that touched the dome, feels strangely prickly, a sensation like thousands of tiny needles pressing into your skin, accompanied by a dry, metallic taste that pools at the back of your throat. You turn slowly to face the other men in the room. They are standing frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They are looking at you, not as their leader or their expert, but as a man who has just walked across the invisible line from which there is no returning. You look down at your watch, noting the exact position of the hands. It is a routine reflex, a requirement for the logbooks. But as you watch the sweep second hand move smoothly past the numbers, you realize the profound irony of the gesture. The clock is still running for them, but for you, the timeline has just been permanently truncated. You feel a strange, detached calm wash over your mind, a psychological shock absorber that shields you from the immediate terror of your situation. You don't scream, you don't panic. With a steady, deliberate voice, you begin to direct the evacuation of the room. You tell them to mark their positions on the floor, to calculate their distance from the workbench, to help the medical teams determine exactly how much radiation each man absorbed in that single catastrophic heartbeat. You take charge because it is the only thing left to do, using the familiar language of protocol to keep the rising tide of chaos at bay. You watch them leave the room, their footsteps hurried but orderly, leaving you alone for a final moment with the apparatus. You look at the screwdriver lying on the table, its purpose unfulfilled, a simple tool that proved inadequate against the monstrous physics of the atomic age. The empire of logic and precision you had climbed to the top of has fractured in an instant, leaving behind only the raw, biological reality of a human body that has received a lethal dose of energy. You walk toward the door, your steps steady but heavy, feeling the first subtle waves of nausea beginning to stir deep in your stomach. As you reach for the brass doorknob, you look back one last time at the demon core, sitting quietly in the dimming light of the afternoon. It has claimed its victory, not through malice, but through the simple, unyielding application of its own nature. The dragon has been tickled one time too many, and as you step out into the hallway, you know that your role as its keeper has come to an end. You find yourself in a different kind of room now, away from the concrete walls of the laboratory and the heavy silence of the workbench. Here, the air is clean, white, and smells faintly of antiseptic and bleached cotton. The window looks out across the vast, sweeping mesas of Los Alamos, where the evening shadows are turning a deep, bruised purple against the orange horizon. The world outside is transitioning into night with a peaceful, natural slowness. But inside your body, an entirely different process has begun. The invisible fire that passed through you in that single blue flash is now silent, working its way through your cells with the cold, unyielding precision of an automated clock. You look down at your hands, resting on the white hospital sheets. They look ordinary, perhaps a little pale, but entirely whole. There are no burns, no scars, no physical marks to show that you have been pierced by millions of silent projectiles moving at nearly the speed of light. It is a strange, psychological distortion. Your mind expects an injury of this magnitude to look monstrous, to show itself in blood and broken bone. Instead, the damage is microscopic, an intimate unraveling of your identity written into the very spirals of your genetic code. You are a ghost, inhabiting a shell that hasn't yet realized it has been destroyed. You listen to the quiet murmur of the doctors in the hallway, their voices hushed and rhythmic, like the prayers of an old religion. They come into your room periodically, checking your pulse, taking your blood, and looking into your eyes with a gentle, professional sorrow that they try to hide behind clipboard charts and clinical terminology. They speak of exposure levels, dose estimates, and a cellular degeneration, terms designed to wrap a sterile insulation around the terrifying reality. They are not looking at a patient they can cure. They are observing a unique scientific phenomenon, documenting the precise, daily progression of an acute radiological event for the history books. You feel a profound sense of detachment as they ask you to reconstruct the exact geometry of the slip. They want to know where your hand was positioned, how many inches separated your chest from the beryllium dome, and the precise angle of the screwdriver when the blade lost its purchase. You answer them calmly, your mind operating with the same analytical clarity that guided your experiments. You find a strange comfort in the math, using the calculations of your own demise to keep your mind anchored, preventing it from drifting into the dark waters of regret or panic. You are still the scientist, even when the specimen on the table is your own life. You notice how the news of the accident has sent a silent shockwave through the entire project colony. The casual confidence that filled the laboratories has evaporated overnight, replaced by a sudden, sharp awareness of the true stakes of the work. Your colleagues come to visit you in small, quiet groups, standing awkwardly near the foot of your bed, holding their hats in their hands. They don't know what to say. They look at you and see their own futures, realizing that any one of them could have been the one holding that screwdriver, that the line separating their brilliant careers from this white room is entirely an illusion of luck. You look out the window as the first stars begin to pin themselves to the velvet canopy of the desert sky. You think of the myths and the legends that will inevitably grow out of this room and that concrete bunker down the road. They will write about you in the official histories. They will talk about the sacrifice made at the frontier of the atomic age. But you know the truth is far less grand. There was no battlefield glory, no grand ideological statement in that room. There was only a tired man, a worn tool, and a fraction of a millimeter of slipped steel. The history books will try to find a grand meaning in it, but the physics itself is entirely indifferent to meaning. You feel the first true waves of internal heat beginning to rise, a deep synthetic fever that originates not from an infection, but from the systemic breakdown of your tissues. Your skin begins to feel tender to the touch, as if you have spent too many hours under a harsh, unnatural sun. The dry metallic taste at the back of your throat has grown thicker, an oily reminder of the ozone scent that filled the laboratory after the flash. You realize that the core is still with you in a way, its signature written into the very rhythm of your failing biology, an invisible companion that will not leave your side until the process is complete. You reflect on the irony of the name the men gave to that grapefruit of metal, the demon core. It wasn't an evil entity. It possessed no malice, no desire to harm, and no consciousness. It was simply an echo of the universe's creation, a piece of primal matter forced into an unnatural shape by human ambition. The true demon wasn't the plutonium sitting on the workbench. It was the collective hubris that believed humanity could hold a star in its hands using nothing more than a common household tool. This realization doesn't bring anger. It brings a deep, quiet melancholy, a sorrow for a brilliant generation that learned how to unlock the secrets of the dark before it learned how to walk safely in the light. You watch the shadow of the window frame move across the floorboards as the moon rises over the mesa, casting a cool silver light across your bed. The light looks remarkably like the blue glow of the ionization, but it carries none of the terror, only the ancient, peaceful stillness of the desert night. You close your eyes, letting the rhythmic beep of the hospital monitors fade into the background, allowing your mind to drift away from the calculations and the data points, preparing yourself for the long, quiet descent into the final chapters of your story. You are resting your head back against the pillow, watching the silver moonlight slice through the dark interior of the hospital room. The room has grown entirely cold, but the fever burning beneath your skin creates an illusion of a sweltering summer night. The clock on the wall continues its rhythmic, mechanical march. Tick, tick, tick. A sound that used to represent the standard pacing of a human life, but now sounds like the distant, fading echo of a world you are systematically leaving behind. The frantic activity of the doctors has finally ceased. The clipboards have been put away. The blood draws have stopped, and the heavy door to your room has been gently clicked shut, leaving you alone with the quiet architecture of your own mind. You look down at your arms, glowing faintly in the pale luminescence of the desert moon. The swelling has begun, a soft, fluid-filled transformation that makes your limbs feel heavy, as if they are being pulled down by the gravity of the earth itself. The pain is no longer a sharp, localized protest. It has become an ambient, atmospheric presence, a deep and philosophical ache that seems to occupy every molecule of your being. Yet, your mind remains strangely, beautifully clear. The confusion and panic that one might expect at the end of a life have been replaced by a crystalline serenity, a hyper-focused awareness that feels very much like the moments before an experiment begins. You find your thoughts wandering back to the core itself, sitting 3 miles away in that dark, locked concrete vault. You know that right now, in the pitch-black silence of the laboratory, those atoms are still moving. They are still decaying at their fixed, mathematical rate, completely indifferent to the fact that the man who held them hours ago is now dissolving in a hospital bed. You realize that the core is not a monument to human triumph, nor is it a symbol of sin. It is simply a physical fact. It is a piece of the universe that has been pulled out of its proper sequence in time, an element that should have remained buried deep within the crust of the earth for billions of years, but was brought into the light by the restless curiosity of men in white coats. You reflect on the nature of the fire that claimed you. In the classical world, fire is something you can see and feel. It is the crackle of wood, the orange leap of a flame, the hot ash that burns the skin. But the fire of the atomic nucleus is an intellectual entity. It is a silent, mathematical abstraction that passes through solid steel, through concrete, and through human flesh, without leaving a scratch on the surface. It doesn't destroy by burning, it destroys by rewriting. It shatters the delicate, invisible bonds that hold your cellular machinery together, turning your own biology into an unreadable, chaotic script. There is a terrifying beauty in that level of purity, a realization that you have been undone by the fundamental laws of reality itself. You recall the faces of your teachers, the brilliant physicists of Europe and America, who taught you how to think about the invisible world. You remember how they spoke of the atom with a sense of reverence, describing the nucleus as a tiny, hidden sanctuary where the secrets of creation were kept under lock and key. They believed that by opening that sanctuary, humanity would enter a golden age of limitless energy and profound understanding. They didn't foresee the concrete bunkers, the barbed wire, or the young men sitting in the desert with screwdrivers, trying to prevent a catastrophe with a piece of hand-tooled steel. You don't feel bitterness toward them. You feel a deep, fraternal sorrow for their innocence. They gave you the keys to the universe, but they didn't realize that the locks were booby-trapped. You notice how your perception of time has begun to stretch and warp in the quiet of the room. A single minute feels like an epoch, a vast expanse of space where you can examine every memory, every choice, and every turning point of your life with perfect clarity. You remember the smell of the damp earth after a rainstorm in your childhood backyard. You remember the sound of your mother's voice calling you inside for dinner. You remember the exact texture of the chalk dust on your fingers during your first university lecture. These moments do not feel like the past. They feel like they are happening right now, existing simultaneously with the heavy thud of your heart and the silver moonlight on the floorboards. The rigid, linear timeline you lived by has dissolved, replaced by a deep, ocean-like stillness where everything is present at once. You hear the wind rising outside, sweeping down from the Yemez Mountains and rushing through the canyons of Los Alamos. It is an ancient, lonely sound, a reminder that this mesa was here long before the scientists arrived with their bulldozers and their equations, and it will remain here long after the laboratories have crumbled into dust. The desert does not care about the Manhattan Project. It does not care about the Cold War or the balance of power between empires. It only knows the rock, the scrub pine, and the unyielding sky. There is a profound comfort in this indifference. It reminds you that your story and the story of the weapon you helped create is just a brief, turbulent ripple on the surface of an infinitely deep pond. You think about the man who will come after you, the next scientist who will be asked to step up to that wooden workbench and take charge of the critical assembly experiments. You wonder if he will be braver than you, or perhaps more cautious. You wonder if he will look at the small scratch on the beryllium dome and understand the story it tells, or if he will treat it as just another piece of hardware to be cleaned and polished. You wish you could leave a note for him, not a technical manual or a list of safety protocols, but a human message. You would tell him to remember the weight of his own hand. You would tell him that the screwdriver is not an instrument of mastery, but a confession of ignorance. You would tell him to look into the silver reflection of the dome and see his own mortality before he begins the dance. You feel the deep, heavy fatigue shifting into a sense of lightness, a gradual easing of the pressure that has locked your muscles for the last 24 hours. The pain hasn't left you, but it has lost its edge, becoming a dull, rhythmic hum that matches the low frequency of the hospital room. You realize that you are no longer fighting the process. You are letting go of the handles, allowing yourself to slide smoothly into the current that is pulling you away from the shore. The isolation that felt so cold and terrifying in the laboratory has transformed into a soft, protective blanket, shielding you from the noise and the friction of the world. You look one last time at the window, where the orange glow of dawn is just beginning to tint the edge of the sky, breaking the long monopoly of the night. The stars are fading, dissolving into the gathering blue light of a new day. It is a beautiful, familiar sight, a reminder that the world will continue to spin, that the sun will continue to rise, and that life will go on in all its chaotic, unpredictable glory. The experiment is over. The data has been recorded, the critical mass has been reached, and the chain reaction has finally come to rest. You close your eyes, letting the breath leave your lungs in a long, peaceful sigh that carries with it the last remnants of your heat, your fatigue, and your memories. The room fades into absolute stillness. The ticking of the clock drops into silence, and you slide gently, safely, and entirely into the deep, uncomplicated dark of the final slumber.